Okay, you guys, I am recording this without Steven, so I do not know if the focus is focused. I don't know if the audio is audioing. I turned the camera on and I said a prayer. So we're going to jump into it, okay? Last week, 2 weeks ago at this point, because we're moving. But anyway, last week we talked about Agent Orange and how it rained death down upon Vietnam's forests. This week, we're going to talk about Operation Popeye and how it literally just rained down rain on Vietnam's forest. Okay, if you're looking at me confused, let me explain. So last week, Anime Gaming 4057 commented, you should talk about Operation Popeye, where we manipulated the weather to make it as horrible as possible for the Viet Cong and its defenders. So, of course, I went, that's insane. There's no way we did that. And then I looked into it and way. So the Vietnam War was a trip, because I'm not saying it was a bad idea, but I'm not saying it was a good idea. It's just an absolutely unhinged idea. Not the Vietnam War. That was an idea for sure. But I'm talking about making it rain on Vietnam. So in today's episode, we're going to be discussing Operation Popeye and also cloud seeding. I know there's a lot of misinformation surrounding cloud seeding and other weather manipulation, so we might as well address all of that head on. Before we jump into what exactly was done in Operation Popeye, though, let's just take a look at cloud seeding and where it began and how it works. So if you've seen any crazy internet conspiracies lately, you'd see that cloud seeding and weather manipulation, they come up quite a bit, especially looking at you, TikTok. I know how the TikTok algorithm works, and no matter what, when the conspiracy theories pop up, I watch them through, and I shouldn't do that because then I just get more and I'm like, what are you talking about? But the worst part is when you go to the comments, people are like, oh my god, and I'm like, some critical thinking, besties, just a tad, an ounce, a smidge. But anyway, we're going to talk about why there is a major distrust for the potential of weather manipulation and hurricanes in Project Cirrus, but that comes later on. It does explain a lot, though, when you know that happened, especially with government distrust. I get it. But also, again, a little critical thinking goes a long way. But as you all know, this past hurricane season, the conspiracy theorists were out in force blaming the destruction in North Carolina from Hurricane Helene on weather manipulation. The crazy thing is, the reasons that they gave for any sort of weather manipulation were, as usual, vague and fear-mongering. And I just want to address that real quick using information from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. There is no technology that exists that can create, destroy, modify, strengthen, or steer hurricanes. Hurricanes are natural phenomena. When it comes to cloud seeding in the US, it is typically done by private companies in western mountain basins to help generate snow. And that's mainly a water resource management approach. In addition, any claims you've seen online saying that radar is being used to steer hurricanes, those are false because radar is an observation tool. It doesn't have the ability to steer a giant storm, but a remote control storm could be kind of fun if you do it out in the ocean. I don't know. Anyway, so let's get back to cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is introducing into clouds or seeding them with substances such as silver iodide, and that enables water droplets to form around the silver iodide or whatever substance you use, and it forms an ice crystal. So the only difference between cloud seeding and the natural precipitation that we see is that typical dust or pollen, they typically take the place of silver iodide. So before we continue, we should absolutely address the silver iodide before someone runs with it and says, it's going to end us all. I mean, there's lots of things that are probably going to end us all, but this one, it's not up there, it's not that big of a concern. So studies have been done to address the levels of silver found after cloud seeding. And while there were increased levels after seeding than there were before, there typically was not a concerning level or anything greater than the EPA's secondary maximum contaminant level. So in addition, there was a 3-year study of cloud seeding done in the San Juan Mountains, and they showed no significant increase in silver levels in different media. So studies have also been done in Florida, the Sierra Nevada mountains, and the Snowy Mountains of Australia. And in these studies, no concerning levels of silver have been found, which leads the EPA and other experts to believe that the silver released in precipitation as a result of cloud seeding is not expected to contribute significant amounts to water. But let's just say it did. Exposure to high levels of silver over long periods of time can lead to argyria, which is a condition that turns skin gray or blue-gray, but it mainly alters the look, like your aesthetic, and it isn't actually harmful. Another important thing to note is that even in areas where cloud seeding is practiced, the majority of precipitation is still natural and it doesn't contain silver iodide. Also, the iodine from silver iodide is not thought of as a concern in general because most organisms, humans included, we need iodine as a micronutrient. Okay, now back to cloud seeding. So back in 1946, Vincent Schaefer, he was working at the General Electric Laboratory trying to create artificial clouds, and he was attempting to do this in a large chamber that was kept at freezing temperatures. In order to keep the cold chamber below freezing, he utilized some dry ice and he placed it in that chamber. Shortly after, he noticed a cloud form around that dry ice that he had just put in there. So what happened here is what we described earlier, where the water droplets, they formed around the seed to produce an ice crystal. So after this discovery, a physicist named Bernard Vonnegut, he discovered that silver iodide was an excellent seed for the formation of these ice crystals. And since that discovery, there has been no other element that has been effective, in creating rain or snow. As I mentioned earlier, according to Santa Ynez Valley News, clouds form from the condensation of water vapor on a nuclei. So whether this is dust, stuff from volcanoes, pollen, smoke, pollution, salt from ocean spray, basically all of this, all it does is it increases the amount of available nuclei for the water vapor to form around. So basically, they're taking a naturally occurring phenomenon and they're just speeding it up by adding silver iodide. Then, after the discovery of how effective silver iodide was at seeding clouds, Project Cirrus emerged. So Project Cirrus was carried out in 1947, 1947, just a year after the discovery by Vincent Schaefer. And I just want to be so clear before we dive into this. I wish I knew why they thought this would be a good idea, but buckle up, it gets wild. Also, a lot of this information that's coming up comes from NOAA. So when Vincent Schaefer initially made the discovery of what happens when he added dry ice to an already cool environment, he reached out to other agencies to work together to see if they could seed clouds with dry ice to alter the weather. The problem is they went about it in the dumbest possible way, and they went straight to testing it on an actual real-life hurricane. So on October 12th, a hurricane that the Air Force called King passed over Florida, causing the typical damage that is expected from a hurricane of its size. And then, it did its damage and then it went out to sea. The people in charge of Project Cirrus, they saw this hurricane that they assumed was moving away from land as the perfect opportunity to test out their cloud seeding. So on October 13th, 1947, two B-17s and a B-29 left Mobile, Alabama, and they flew toward that hurricane. So this hurricane was at this point 415 miles east of Jacksonville, Florida, and one of the B-17s, it ended up it flew above the hurricane and it dumped dry ice into the clouds of the storm below. They didn't fly into the eye because they didn't have the equipment for it, but they seeded the outer clouds of the storm. Meanwhile, Vincent Schaefer, he was in the B-26 monitoring what they were doing with the experiment. So this is almost verbatim from NOAA, so as not to mess any information or details up, okay? The way the experiment was done was, on the first run, which was a half hour, over 100 miles, they dumped 80 pounds of ice along the way. They then went back to see what that did to the clouds. They then followed up with 2 more runs, dropping 50 pounds each into one large cumulus top, and then they watched to see any changes. After the first run, they noticed the cloud deck began to break up. After the second test, the cloud top continued to grow. After these observations were done, they then left and they returned to base in Mobile. The following day, they went back out to the predicted location of the storm, the spot where they predicted it should be, and they couldn't really find the eye of the storm. When they did find the eye of the storm, it was 100 miles west of where it was expected to be. It had made a 135-degree left turn and was rapidly moving toward land, and all the while, it was growing stronger. So on the 15th of October, 1947, Hurricane King made landfall in Savannah, Georgia, and it caused $2 million in damages in Georgia and South Carolina and ended up killing one person. So in this instance, when people were like, oh my God, they controlled the storm and they killed people, keep in mind it was 1947, I also would have been up in arms. I'd have been like, oh my God. In addition, the head of GE's laboratories released a statement saying that he was 99% sure that the storm changed course because of the seeding experiment. And of course, that's not what GE wanted to hear because people were threatening lawsuits. So luckily for them, Dr. Francis Reicheldorfer, the chief of the Weather Bureau, was able to work with his weathermen to find a case where a similar thing happened with a hurricane that was not seeded. And people calmed down a bit. But this event did change everybody's perspective on weather manipulation and cloud seeding. And further experimentation had to be kept quieter due to the general mistrust by the general population. Like people were like, absolutely not. You're not messing with the weather. So the next attempt at weather manipulation in the form of cloud seeding wasn't carried out until 11 years later, and all of it was kept very quiet until they were really, really sure that the hurricane wasn't going to sway off course and cause trouble for them again. But things didn't really get interesting or promising for cloud seeding until 1962, when Project Stormfury was introduced. With Project Stormfury, which I gotta say, these names are actually pretty good. But Project Stormfury was a new attempt by the U.S. Weather Bureau and the Department of Defense to seed hurricanes. It lasted from 1962 to 1983. The idea that was being tested was that they would seed the clouds outside of the eye wall of the storm, which would in turn lead to competition for the original eye wall, causing a reformation of the eye wall, which increased the radius of that eye, leading to reduced intensity. NOAA and its predecessor, they tried to weaken hurricanes in this manner. Scientists seeded clouds in hurricanes Esther in 1961, Beulah in 1963, Debbie in 1969, and Ginger in 1971. These are good names. So these hurricane seedings were done far from land, having learned their lesson with Hurricane King. However, in the mid-80s, the seeding attempts to weaken hurricanes were found to not be as promising due to observations of unseeded hurricanes. So what they ended up finding was that, one, cloud seeding wasn't very successful with hurricanes because they had too much natural ice and too little supercooled water. Basically, cloud seeding needs sufficient supercooled water for cloud seeding to work, and these hurricanes, they did not have that. Also, if you're wondering what supercooled water is, it's just water that remains liquid below the freezing point. So the second thing was the positive results that were found in the earlier experiments, like from 1962 onwards, on hurricanes, this came from the fact that they didn't know enough about the behavior of hurricanes to know if human intervention was in fact making a significant difference. So with access to new information on the natural behavior of hurricanes, it was found that unseeded hurricanes actually naturally formed outer eye walls, so it was almost impossible to tell if they were actually having any impact on the storms by seeding. And all of this now brings us to Operation Popeye. So Operation Popeye was a weather modification operation that utilized cloud seeding in North Vietnam and Laos in order to disrupt communication lines. They wanted to disrupt the communication lines, troop and equipment movements, and to suppress enemy anti-aircraft missile fire of the North Vietnamese troops. The goal was to increase rainfall to levels that hindered the Vietnamese military operations and made a lot of the country unable to be traversed. They did not want people to be able to easily travel. So in a New York Times article from 1972, and I'm not joking, I found the archive of it, a former CIA agent was quoted as saying, quote, "We first used that stuff in about August of 1963 when the Diem regime was having all that trouble with the Buddhists. They would just stand around during demonstrations when the police threw tear gas at them. But we noticed that when the rains came, they wouldn't stay on," end quote. So they used it as a means of crowd control, which I guess creative problem solving? I don't know. So while the CIA may have first used it around 1962 to 1963, and then they used it again in 1964 in Saigon, the initial tests for Operation Popeye's military use actually began in 1966. So the test phase was approved and conducted in a strip of the Lao panhandle. So this test was unknown to the Laos authorities and was only known by very few US officials. But in the test phase, 50 cloud seeding experiments were conducted. And guys, I'm getting this information from history.state.gov, and I'm going to keep it as close to what they wrote as possible so as not to mess up any of these details. So from their tests, they saw that 82% of the seeded clouds produced rain within a brief period after seeding. The amount of rainfall induced by seeding was sufficient to contribute to affecting the travel of the enemy routes, which was their overall goal. They decided that they saw success in being able to alter and increase precipitation in the area. Now, I don't know how they quantify that because I don't think there was a way to quantify it. And we also have to remember that in monsoon season, it is going to rain a lot regardless. So we aren't 100% sure what the exact results, because I could not find the exact published results of that study. But when they did their seeding, they were like, oh, it rained more than it would have. So who knows? Would it have rained the same amount? And they just were like, definitely we did that. Or did they actually do something? Who knows? Essentially, the goal of ruining roads, flooding rivers, and making parts of Vietnam unsuitable for travel was, in the eyes of the Department of Defense, being met after their initial trials. So on March 20th, 1967, the operational phase of Project Popeye began. So pilots would take canisters of silver iodide and release them into existing storms with the hopes that they would increase precipitation. So according to Popular Science, U.S. taxpayers paid roughly $3.6 million a year, or $23 million in today's dollars, without their knowledge, to fund Project Popeye. The thing is, according to the 1972 New York Times article, officials were really torn on the operation. So many agreed that it accomplished its mission, but many others were in disagreement with even doing seeding in the first place. However, when State Department officials protested the operation due to the unknown environmental impact, other officials responded with statements such as, quote, "What's worse, dropping bombs or rain?" Which, when you put it like that, ideally neither would have been my response, but, Ultimately, once the details of Operation Popeye were revealed to the public, there was increased concern on weather manipulation used in war, as well as general distrust for politicians, since keeping a secret as large as this had Americans and the rest of the world wondering as to what other secrets were being kept from them. So eventually, legislators would work toward an international treaty banning weather manipulation. I quoted Fat Electrician in my last video. It's never a war crime the first time. And the funny thing about it is, the US was like, oh yeah, we should definitely have some rules against this thing that we just did. Let's establish those right now. And I think that's so funny. It's like, you did the thing to get into trouble, but then you were like, listen. Nobody else should ever do this thing that we just did, because I don't want you to, do that to me. I don't know. It's just kind of funny. But even though today weather manipulation would send up immediate war crime flags, back then there were no explicit rules against it. However, once it came to light, the US and the former Soviet Union, they passed an international agreement through the UN in 1976. It was called the Environmental Modification Convention, and it banned any military or hostile force from undertaking any action that could result in earthquakes, tsunamis, an upset in the ecological balance of a region, changes in weather patterns, changes in climate patterns, changes in ocean currents, changes in the state of the ozone layer, and changes in the state of the ionosphere. So they covered everything. However, due to the nature of weather manipulation and on how hard it can be to identify if someone is actually attempting it, there are still fears that countries or entities may be carrying out these activities. And we can see that in the general mistrust and the amount of conspiracies that are constantly spread on social media due to weather-related incidents. Because again, how would we really know? How would we know? It just rains more, there's more wind. How would we know? It's just one of those things where you just have to trust. It's a tough one, because we wouldn't know if some other, I guess you would be able to monitor the airspace. That much I know. It's just one of those things. So as far as we know, though, any acts of cloud seeding are currently done by private companies or state agencies today. And it's usually for things like increasing groundwater availability through increased precipitation. And it's used in at least 8 states in the western United States and in dozens of countries around the world to boost their precipitation. In western states where there's a risk of drought, increasing the amount of snow is essential for freshwater supply when the snow melts in spring, especially since the past 2 decades have been the driest in that region since the 1500s. One important thing to note, however, is that while cloud seeding was being used for years and researched for years, a lot of the proof for it comes from the understanding of the physics for why it should work, and also some statistical results. Having definitive proof was almost impossible for most of the time that cloud seeding has been researched, because you would need to have 2 separate experiments in the same location, one with cloud seeding and one without. And until recently, performing this type of experiment was almost impossible. But with new technology, scientists have been able to shift the question from does cloud seeding work to when does it work and how effective is it under different conditions. So the study that provided the first quantitative evidence for cloud seeding was known as the SNOWY project. So it's SNOWIE, and it was short for Seeded and Natural Orographic Wintertime Clouds, which it's a good name. Basically, for 3 days in January 2017, they had the perfect cloudy conditions. The sky was cloudy with no snowfall, and over the course of 3 days, a research plane released the same amount of silver iodide over the course of like a dozen trips. After sufficient seeding, scientists were able to use radar equipment to monitor the response from the clouds as the silver iodide was released. So over the course of those 3 days, about 286 Olympic swimming pools worth of snow fell from these seeded clouds. So thanks to this study, scientists can now simulate the effect of silver iodide on clouds and use those simulations to conduct the exact type of controlled experiments that were required like all those years before as proof of cloud seeding. So with all of these advancements, cloud seeding is becoming more and more likely as a possible solution for increasing water availability, with China having the largest cloud seeding program in the world. So according to an article in The Diplomat, China plans to have about 5.5 million square kilometers of its land under its weather modification plan by this year, 2025. So this is being done in the hopes to boost agricultural productivity and to curb natural disasters like droughts. The issue, however, is that weather manipulation of that scale throughout any country is sure to have downstream effects on their neighbors. However, the long-term geopolitical and environmental issues are yet to be seen as so much of cloud seeding is still so new, which is crazy because it's literally been around for decades, you know? But yeah, that is everything I have for you guys today. I hope you learned something. I mean, I sure did. Please leave me suggestions for other topics. I've been eyeing chemtrails, but I don't know if that's too spicy of a topic for YouTube. So let me know in the comments. Bye, guys.